Saul had died in battle fighting the Philistines, as had his son Jonathan. David had found victory against the Amalekites and recovering all of his things from Ziklag. Now what would happen to the story of Israel? Now that the first king of Israel was dead. This will be the story that we find in the book that we call the book of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel is a poorly named book because Samuel, the prophet, had died before any of the events took place within this book. He died back in 1 Samuel. Both of these books are likely written by a historical prophet at some point based on all the collections of all the events that took place around this time. We do better understand it in terms of the Greek name of it, Second Reigns. Looking at 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings is kind of a coherent historical narrative of the days of the kings of Israel and Judah. And 2nd Reigns, or 2nd Samuel, is telling the story of the reign of David, which is from around 1003 to 963 BC, the beginning of the 10th century BC. And this is Israel, as we're going to see, reaching its great height and its empire, and a lot of that has to do with David. And the story, therefore, is told here, and the author is telling the story to exalt David and all David was accomplished through God, but also to contextualize and frame all of the challenges that David would experience in his household in terms of the sin that David had committed involving Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite. As the narrative begins, as we said, Saul has died, so has Jonathan. David is made aware of this, and those who would bring it in the news as if it was to be celebrated found themselves being executed because they presumed to have killed Saul, the Yahweh's anointed. And then David mourns and laments, composes this lament hymn at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 1, which is a very famous, do not tell it not in Gath, things of that nature. Talking about his deep friendship that he had with Jonathan. Your love was very dear to me, more special to me than the love of women, in 2 Samuel 1 and verse 26. At this point, David goes up to Hebron, and the Judahites make him their king. So when we say David is a king for 40 years, he's 40 years king over Judah. At the same time, the other Israelite tribes make Ishbaal, son of Saul, their king. Now, he's called Ishbosheth in most texts. In Samuel, that's what it says in the Hebrew. Bosheth is a shameful thing. And so that's the kind of a scribal alteration later on. In Chronicles, his name is given Ishbaal. We're calling him Ishbaal because that was his actual name. That's what would have been recognized back there in the 10th century. And Ishbaal has Abner as his great champion. And the army of Ishbaal and David fight, and David's army will get the better of it, but Joab's younger brother Asael, one of the mighty men of David, will fall in battle against Abner. Abner, however, will be insulted by Ishbaal and will try to defect to David and to David's camp. He wants Michal, his ex-wife, back as a demonstration of power. But Joab has not forgotten what Abner did to his brother and doesn't trust Abner anyway, and Joab has Abner killed. Joab goes out and kills Abner under a ruse. And this is not taken well by David or by anybody. And David is able to mollify the Israelites by his actions of mourning and his rebuke of Joab that this was not actually his intention. Again, making us try to always, this text is always trying to help us understand that he does not bear any ill will to the house of Saul, even though you would imagine he had reason to. And for his political purposes, we can understand why he would want to alleviate any of those concerns. In chapter 4, however, this Ishbaal will fall prey to some of his eunuchs and some of the house intrigue and be assassinated. These eunuchs thought David would honor them for that, and in fact, David has them executed for it. David is not going to countenance this kind of behavior. And so in chapter 5, we see that now David has consolidated his rule over all Israel, and all Israel makes him king. And this is 7 years after he has been made king in Hebron, so he rules for 33 years as king over all Israel. First thing that he does is he wants to set up a new capital, and there's that Jerusalem city there, the Jebusite city in the middle of Benjamin and Judah that has not been yet overrun by the Israelites. And Joab is able to get into the wall and start it off, and they're able to capture Jerusalem, and David makes it his capital. David will also begin defeating the Philistines, and this will become a major part of his reign, as we're going to see in a few moments. But David also wants to have God's presence near him. And so he calls for the ark to come to Jerusalem. And of course, in the situation, he's very celebrating. Uzzah will try to keep the ark from falling over, tipping over. He is struck dead for touching it. David's a little concerned about that. They get all the strictures and standards right. They then bring the ark to Jerusalem. He's dancing before it in a way that his wife Michal despises him. Michal will chastise him for it, and David will curse her with barrenness, and that is why he has no children through Michal. And that line of the house of Saul will end up not being much of anything in any way, shape, or form. In the beginning of chapter 7 is when David has a desire to build a temple for God. He has this house of cedar that he lives in from the king of Tyre, but God is in a tent. And Nathan first tells him to do what was in his heart, but then God tells Nathan it is not for him to do that. He has blood on his hands. His son will build me a house. But because of the sentiment, because of the heart of David, God promises to David that David will be given an eternal house, that the rule will not depart from them. The house of Saul has fallen, but the house of David would not thus fall the way that the house of Saul had fallen, and his dynasty would be continual. And afterward, in chapter 7, David offered a prayer thanking God for his great majesty and his great provision for him. Chapters 8 through 10, the majority of those chapters, feature David as the mighty king. David is the king Israel wanted. David is more successful than the Israelites could ever dream of. Remember, it hadn't been that long before where the Israelites were a barely coordinated or constantly feuding and fighting group of 12 tribes being absolutely destroyed by the Philistines and oppressed by the Philistines. Now David goes out and smashes the Philistines time and time again to the point where the Philistines will no longer ever be an oppressor of the Israelites. And by doing so, he's able to supplant them. And he will now attack everybody else around them. The Ammonites, the Moabites, all are defeated by him. The Arameans are now moving into the area. We know this is something that happens historically in this period. This is, of course, the quote-unquote Dark Ages, at the collapse of the Bronze Age, that the Arameans now kind of come in and populate, especially the areas to the north of Israel. Later on, they will gain strength, but at this time, their strength is not that great, and David is able to triumph over them. And David is able to project power all the way to the Euphrates River and to the Brook of Egypt, the river of Egypt there, which is just across Gaza. And he is able to maintain this Israelite empire that had been promised to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and to the fathers, that in David you have the ultimate fulfillment of all that God had promised to the Israelites in the empire that David was able to build. Likewise, David wanted to show kindness to the house of Jonathan, remembering his promise to Jonathan, his love for Jonathan, and Jonathan had a son, Meribaal. Yes, the text says Mephibosheth. Same thing with Ishbosheth. Mephibosheth, it's in Chronicles as Meribaal. His name was Meribaal. And David showed him great kindness, even though he had been handicapped, and gave great provision for him. And he will show up in the narrative again. The Ammonite king would humiliate David's servants, and David would send out his military against them. And this is the context in which we now have David's great collapse and fall. He should now be able to enjoy all the fruit of his labor, the fruit of his conquest, and then celebrate. But while the army's out and he's not with it, he's up there on his roof and he sees a woman bathing. He's got higher than everybody else. He was looking and he shouldn't have been looking. And this woman, Bathsheba, was cleansing herself from her ritual impurity. She was not trying to be seductive in any way, shape, or form. David liked what he saw. David called for her. He had relations with her, and she got pregnant. And this was, we should not presume that this was in any way, shape, or form Bathsheba's desire or choice. Bathsheba's married to Uriah the Hittite, one of David's mighty men. And so he first wants to pawn the kid off on Uriah, calls Uriah back, wants Uriah to spend some time with his wife. Uriah refuses to do that while the military is in the field. And so David has Uriah's death sentence written up, given it to Uriah, because he trusts Uriah enough not to look at it, and knows it'll be given to Joab. And so the next battle, they go out, Uriah's put up front, everybody shrinks back, Uriah's killed by the Ammonites. Bathsheba finds out, Bathsheba mourns, Bathsheba then comes in the house of David. God saw, God was not happy. So in chapter 12 of 2 Samuel, Nathan, the prophet, court prophet for David, comes in with his parable about the rich man, the poor man with his poor sheep, and how the poor man was extorted out of his sheep. David is incensed at this. Nathan says, "You are the man," and the condemnation is given. You were not. Didn't I gave you all these wives? I gave you all this stuff. It wasn't enough for you. You abused your power. You did things privately. I'm going to do them publicly. You killed him, Uriah, with the sword of the Ammonites. The sword will never leave your house. And so this now is going to set the stage for the rest of the narrative of 2 Samuel in chronological sense, telling of all the difficulties that attend to David and his reign. And just before that, we get the immediate after effects. Well, there's a war going on with the Ammonites, right? Well, the Ammonites and the Arameans are defeated. David comes in and is able to celebrate his victory over the Ammonites. He goes home. The child of his and Bathsheba's that would die. But then he comforted Bathsheba, and she would give birth again to a son who would be Solomon, who, of course, would be much more important in the book of 1 Kings. Now, David has a lot of family members in his house, a lot of children with different women. And so he's got sons Absalom and Amnon, and he's got also a daughter Tamar. Tamar and Absalom are full siblings, and Amnon is a half-sibling to them. Amnon gets the hots for Tamar and has a friend who instigates the opportunity for him to get with Tamar privately. Amnon will rape Tamar, and when he's done with his deed, he despises Tamar and sends her off, shaming her. David finds out, not happy about it, doesn't do a lot about it. Amnon finds out, stews about it. 2 years later, there's a sheep shearing that Absalom invites everybody, including Amnon, to. And Absalom makes it so that Amnon is killed in that experience. And because of that, he exiles himself to Geshur for a while. But Joab knows that David loves Absalom, would love to have him back, sends this old woman with a ruse and a story about it to get them back. And so Absalom's brought back to Jerusalem, hangs out in Jerusalem for a couple of years, doesn't get to have a standing in front of the king, gets mad at Joab for not responding, burns Joab's field, gets Joab's attention. Joab gets him in before David. Everything seems to be going well. Chapter 15, however, we see Absalom, very, very aesthetically pleasing young man, starts winning the hearts of the Israelites over, promising them justice in a way that David wasn't giving it to them. Then says, I made a vow, I want to go fulfill it at Hebron. He goes to Hebron, and he has himself declared king in Hebron. And so now Absalom is leading a full insurrection against David. And the numbers are with Absalom. The more the people do, Ahithophel, the great counselor, goes along with him. David runs away from Jerusalem with his group, leaves some people, especially Hushai the Archite, in town as kind of a spy to see what's going on there. Would not have the ark leave Jerusalem. He goes up. He gets insulted by Shimei on the way up. Barzillai provides some food for him. Ziba, who is the servant of Meribaal, slanders Meribaal and provides provisions for David. And so we find out what Ahithophel gives advice to Absalom for. He goes in Jerusalem, violates his wife's concubines in front of everybody. Ahithophel says, go attack your father immediately before he can regroup. And David's plant spy says, that's not a good idea, because if David gets any kind of victory, you're going to be in trouble. Consolidate your forces and then go after David. And everybody, God gave a spirit for them to accept Hushai's recommendation. And so Hushai then sends news about this quickly to David, and David crosses the Jordan and prepares for this to take place. Ahithophel goes and kills himself because he sees how this is all going to go. And then we have a great battle. Absalom and his forces come. There's battle against them. His hair gets caught up in a tree. Joab is made aware of this. Joab has his armor bearers go kill Absalom. Absalom is dead. Joab blows a trumpet. There's no more reason for insurrection. The guy who was the insurrectionist died. Everybody goes back to their tents. David is waiting for news about the battle and eventually finds out that his son Absalom is dead and starts crying over it. And Joab goes and said, look, we all know you'd rather all of us be dead and Absalom live. But here's the thing. These guys almost died for you. It'd be nice to say something nice to them. And so David will then say something nice to those who had preserved his reign and is welcomed back by the Judahites. Shimei repents, but he'll have what he's got coming to him later. Meribaal goes and says, hey, Ziba was, spoke ill of me, but Meribaal is just happy that David survived. Judah welcomes David back. The Israelites and Judah start having some verbal spats about bringing David back, but David is reestablished as king. In chapter 20, we find out there's this Benjaminite named Sheba who rises up in revolt against David. The army's sent out, and he goes to Abel Beth-Maachah, and there's a wise woman, Abel Beth-Maachah, when Joab and all the forces are besieging, and realizing that no one wants to destroy the city. We just want Sheba's head. Sheba's head's brought out, end of the revolt. And that's what the end of the narrative in terms of the chronological at this end. We're told all the various officers that David has. Everything is now stable. There are chapter 21 through 24, and these are a series of appendices. We call them appendices, not the text doesn't call them that, but they're stories that involve David and his life that fit other parts of the narrative, but they're not put in the narrative order. They're just kind of added at the end. And so there's the revenge of the Gibeonites. There's a famine in the land because Saul had killed the Gibeonites, which the Israelites in the days of Joshua had made a covenant with. And so some sons of Saul had to die for it. And so they were given and killed. Rizpah, the concubine of Saul, mourns about all of this, and all the bodies are recovered and buried in the tomb of Kish of Benjamin, and the famine is alleviated. There's all kinds of battles going on, and the various victories that go on. This is also where we learn about all the killing of the various giants in Gath, and why that all happened. And that's where we hear Elhanan, killed the brother of Goliath the Gittite, or was it Goliath who he killed and led to all that controversy, is there mentioned there in 2 Samuel 21. 2 Samuel 22 is the same psalm of David as in Psalm 18, where David sings when he is delivered from all of his enemies. The chapter 23 begins with the final words of David, glorifying God and his strength. We're then told about all of the warriors, David, the 3 and the 30, actually 37, but of course some die and some are added to, including, of course, Uriah. This is telling us that David's your last real warlord king. Yes, these mighty men, very important stories, but you have mighty men stories when you don't have a centralized bureaucracy. When you have a fully centralized bureaucracy, your generals, your soldiers don't matter as much because they're part of this very organized army. When you have individuals and their valor, it's a little bit more of a slightly less organized situation. And that's what is marked there by having these mighty men. But of course, David is able to bring it so that Solomon, his son, will be able to enjoy that centralized bureaucracy because it's what David has been building up to and able to consolidate. David is so much more, has so many more of the trappings of a king than Saul ever did because of his successes and the consolidation of power and all these things. But of course, he has been bedeviled by all these things going on in his family. The last part of the appendix is chapter 24, very famous, of course, as the time where David is inside to create a military census, trying to figure out the strength of Israel. God didn't tell him to do that. Joab doesn't want to, does it anyway. David realizes he's sinned. Gad comes in and tells him his options. David wants to go in the hand of God. God has a pestilence on the land, kills many people, stops at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. David goes there. Araunah offers him for offering. He will not offer anything to his God that he didn't pay for, so David buys it all, builds an altar there, offers there, and the whole thing is allayed. That will be the place that Solomon built the temple. That was the place, according to legend, that Abraham offered Isaac. And that's where the narrative ends in 2 Samuel. And so we can see in 2 Samuel the story of David, right, and how David is the ultimate king Israel was looking for. And brought Israel to its greatest extent and established the Israelite Empire, the greatest force in the Levant in the 10th century, there, as we can tell, as far as we can tell there. And yet we can see that he let the power go to his head, and he sexually assaulted Bathsheba. He had Uriah killed, and he suffered the consequences. And of course, when you're a king, there's very little of just personal consequences. It also led to a lot of other people suffering, a lot of other deaths, a lot of other problems. And it's a great warning for us about the consequences of our behaviors and how it can extend and very much lead us, even when we're faithful to God. The ways in which we're faithless to God may cause us great grief, and not just us, but for many people also. I'm so thankful that you've joined us. If you have any questions, comments, or thoughts about what we've seen here in 2 Samuel, love for you to let us know in the comments and continue our conversation. Please share and subscribe if you found this beneficial. I'm Ethan with the Adventist Church of Christ. We are a non-denominational church of Christians in Los Angeles that would love to be of encouragement and service to you. Would you like for us to pray with you? Can we study the Bible with you? Would you like to meet with us? How can we be of service? Please let us know by reaching out to us at AdventistChurchOfChrist.org. You can also find us on social media at Adventist Church of Christ. We again thank you. May the Lord bless and keep you until we will meet again.